Hello, everyone. I'm going to be asking my dad about media nostalgia in the 80s because you were a teenager in the 80s, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So you knew that back then a lot of the most popular movies and TV shows were set in the 50s, right?
Yes, many of them were.
Okay. So in my presentation, I mentioned Grease and Happy Days and The Outsiders as examples, but what movies or TV shows set in the 50s did you really resonate with as a teenager?
Well, there was a movie called Hoosiers, which was about basketball, set in a small town in Indiana. I resonated with that because the players on the team, some of them were very good and some were not as good. And it reminded me of when I played baseball, how you'd have the superstars and then just the people that are just filling out the roster. And then oftentimes the players who were not as good would get an opportunity, to shine or fail. And I resonated with that because I would see that happening in my own life.
Okay. So would you say because they depicted young people doing sports as teenagers, that was sort of similar to your life?
Yeah, absolutely. And also the interaction between the players and the coach of the team, who was the main star, Gene Hackman.
Okay. And as for like the scenery and the clothing and the songs and things like Grease, did any of that nostalgia like give you a sort of escape from your day-to-day life?
Well, speaking of Grease, I loved it because of the music. I loved the singing and the dancing.
Okay.
I got a kick out of John Travolta playing a teenager because he was, I think, a little bit older.
Yeah, definitely.
And I like the dynamic of the biker, or excuse me, the motor, what do you call it? Race car gang.
They raced cars in Grease.
Yeah, so Grease Lightning.
Yes, yeah.
I like that because when I was in the 80s, I was just starting to drive, and my friends and I would race motorcycles. That's how I was taking bikes.
Okay.
And also we would drive cars and soup them up. Some of them were systematic. And
okay.
And a whole nine yards.
Okay, so for you personally, how much did the nostalgia resonate with you versus that on a wider scale during the 80s for people your age?
I'm not sure for me that it was that I was thinking of the nostalgia, but looking back on it now, I realize that a lot of the themes, the things that were going on, were interesting because it was from the 50s, and I didn't live in the 50s, so it gave me an opportunity to see like what it was like, and it was always portrayed as a simpler time, and when everyone got along, and for the most part, and so it's kind of fantasy, kind of things that you wish would be a certain way. There's another movie called American Graffiti, which was about, again, cars. Cars were a huge thing in the 50s, especially in small towns.
Okay.
There was nothing else to do. So there's no internet, there's no fax machines.
Yeah. Okay. So a big key aspect to nostalgia back then, media-induced nostalgia back then versus now, is how back then it wasn't at your fingertips. It wasn't something you could just turn on or off at will.
Right.
So when you experienced that kind of nostalgia, did it end for you? Like, were you thinking about it afterwards, after the TV turned off? Or was it like, oh, I'm just going to live in the moment when I'm watching it, and then I'm going to get back to my own life?
That's a great question. It depends on the movie.
Okay.
So, for instance, there was a movie called Hollywood Nights, which was one of these formulaic high school guys are in a gang called the Knights, and Tony Danza was the leader of the gang, and he went on to do TV shows.
Okay.
It was one of his first movies, but after the movie, I think it was like it was made in 1980, set in the 50s. Friends of mine and I who went to see the movie together, we thought it was really cool that they wore those jackets, so we created our own like version of the jackets to be our own little gang. But in the movie, the gang would just do silly pranks. It wasn't like
not a
when you
real
think of
gang.
a typical bad person gang. It was just more like you felt part of a group, and so the nostalgia carried on. Something like Grease, not at all. It would be more just in the moment,
Okay.
singing. It was fun to do the songs, but it wasn't like unless I had the album, or they had back then they had something called an 8-track tape with the songs on it.
Okay.
So, that I would play that, in the car or something. But
So we would have to really resonate with you for it to carry over.
yeah, especially when you're a teenager. So I was in high
Okay.
school. If something hits me like, hey, you're part of a team, that's something.
Okay.
Drag racing, I didn't do any drag racing, but we did racing, on tracks and things like that on our motorcycles, and that came from
Okay.
movies like Hollywood Nights and American Graffiti.
It's starting to sound like it did resonate with you, but I don't think it was wanting to be a member of that time period and like really wanting to go back, and like you weren't satisfied with your day to day, but it was more like a fun break, and then you would kind of pick up on themes from the movies and then do it with your friend group. Because I feel like now, and I'll talk to Aaron about this in my next interview, it's like it becomes a sort of personality trait to have like 90s or 80s nostalgia and like in your clothing and stuff like that. Probably because of how accessible it is. But thank you for talking to me about this.
You're
Appreciate
very
it.
welcome. I appreciate the interview and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Bye, class.